that.
Because my son was like, he's at Berkeley, and he was like, okay, so you walk out of class, okay, you're interrupting class. Is that really helping anything? Is it helping the people that have the problems that become the shooter? No, it's not addressing those issues. It's just it's symbolic. You've just walked out of school and now you've interrupted education. Yeah. And he was a little irritated by the whole thing.
I said to my students who were talking about it before, I said, what's the point of walking out? What are you walking to?
And ISD in that
You
too.
put together a program that helps you feel better and helps you connect with each other, because when you make connections, you don't want to harm each other.
Well, exactly,
so
and that's
I
what this
made a
letter was
suggestion.
about.
Yeah, it was the walk up, right?
Yeah.
Instead of walk out, walk up. Did it say that? There was one of those too.
No. To look and see what it was. It was a letter from a teacher.
Okay.
No, I thought this was relatively mundane. I don't know.
It was more, change
I guess I didn't think it was going to be that much.
change your
I didn't understand that.
behavior rather than,
I didn't realize the
walking out per se.
just to reload.
I didn't even. I think, I don't know, I thought it was.
Hank's still looking for something.
So there was something attached to what you sent us, but I could not open it.
I don't know what it was. I couldn't open it either. It wasn't a letter. It must have been some like legend or something like that. Is that the right word?
I don't know what it was.
We'll put her on the spot.
This is
But
the,
she did not send anything to me. I asked when for coming in.
okay.
I was doing it from my phone.
No, we leave on 29.
What?
I read this. Yep.
I thought it was a very worthwhile read.
Yes. No, that was good. I really liked that. That was a good letter.
You know what? No prior minutes.
Yep.
Interesting. Probably because this is a special meeting.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
Yeah, last one. My wife's still working on the final details.
This is more special.
I asked her.
Oh yeah, Airbnb, we're going with a family, so we gotta rent a house just big enough. I figure we'll have to. It's a job that's expensive.
Go to the grocery store.
I know.
Is he still trying to get something? Okay. What? Okay. Let me make sure it's okay with him. I want to go ask, and then I'll get it
Out
started.
of town last week. Here, who's just there. This was my text was my to you every morning when I got up. It didn't suck. Grand Cayman.
The Icelandic stuff.
Yeah.
If I had like retired tomorrow,
Yeah.
funny story.
Trader Joe started selling a version of it. It's like you could do like a Chobani knockoff yogurt in the Icelandic, and there's so much
So my friend lives
than just the
there.
package.
Okay, folks,
It's good.
we're gonna call the meeting to order. Hank is printing off some informational material. We'll take roll call. We'll start with Kim.
Kimberly Watts.
Aaron Sullivan?
David Schwartz.
Martha Schroed.
Jill Plamper.
Mike Wright.
Sheldon Cohn.
Allison Iverson.
And Andy Doctoroff, and welcome to everyone. Mayor, is this a wedding and you don't have family members, or what? Okay. Yeah, this is
I was
kind of
wondering that when I saw him sitting there by himself. I thought to myself,
It's kind of like the Bat Cave where things are kind of tilted.
are they trying to tell you something?
Yeah, but the first order of the next item on the agenda is the approval of tonight's agenda. Anyone will make a motion?
Motion to approve.
Second?
Second.
Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay, and agenda is approved. The next item on the agenda is the matter of discussion of the site plan review ordinance for the Detroit Zoo. And I think I'd like to just spell out how I personally think this should go. I think that we should hear from Hank and Amy at the outset. I think then that members of the commission can make any initial comments that they would make to each other or ask questions of Hank and Amy. Then we'd open it up for public participation as we did the last time. And again, as we did last time, we're going to require that comments be limited to 2 minutes without conversation, although questions would be permitted if there are questions. And then we'll close public participation and open it up back again to the commission to see if there are any desired changes to this ordinance. I will say that just as a matter of historical record, when this matter was placed on the agenda a couple months ago, and it was decided that this is something that the commission would revisit because so much time and effort was placed into this, was put into this that long while ago. I think most of the members of the commission were under the impression that the ordinance was something different than what it actually is. During that meeting, we were reading from an initial version of the ordinance that was not promulgated. And I think that since that discussion, we all learned that the ordinance was different than the one that was being read from at that meeting, which to me is relevant, at least, in terms of framing our discussion. I'll also point out that, we, last month, 3 weeks ago or so, we did apply the ordinance, if you will, to the very contentious Tiger exhibit, or what seemed to be contentious at the time at least, and we became familiarized with it as it is to be applied in all practicality in the real world. So with that background, I would like to ask Amy, would you like to say anything, and where is Hank? Does he want to say anything? Hank? Oh, you? But,
You summed it up very nicely.
Okay.
This was, ordinance was adopted, with, the site plan review shortly thereafter. We had a real practical case with the tiger habitat expansion. There were some residents that are concerned with development in the zoo. They came to the city commission, so city commission has asked the planning commission to relook at the ordinance now that it's been in place and applied, to see whether or not you think there's room for improvement, or you thought that it worked as it was supposed to. And because the planning commission deals with the zoning ordinance, and that's where this ordinance is located, it's back in your ballpark for review.
before we open it up to the commission, let me ask, has anyone proposed any specific changes to the current ordinance, the one that actually has been promulgated?
Not to my office, no.
Okay. Do you have any opinions that we could consider, or recommendations that we could consider, as to whether there is any expressed need to change what we have done? Is there any new information to suggest that our decision-making was ill-informed or incomplete at the time? What's your opinion, if any?
You mean in terms of the application process?
No, just the ordinance that we're going to be reviewing tonight.
No, I don't have any recommendations.
Okay. Hank, the question was, has there been any information brought to your attention to suggest that there would be an appropriate need to change the ordinance as promulgated? Do you have any recommendation, opinion? Because we do want to hear from the community, obviously.
Right, there's been, I have had no new information since the last meeting that would lead me to believe otherwise, and I don't have an opinion if that's up to the planning commission.
Okay. So thank you for that. What I will do is ask, and we don't have to go around the horseshoe here, before we open it up to public participation, does any member of the commission have any opinion, concern to frame the issue so that we can take those into account as we listen to public participation? Allison and then Sheldon.
Okay,
So primarily, I guess, in my looking into some of the similar zoos that, similar to our neighborhood, the one thing that I was really surprised and pleased to see is the landscape buffer. And I think that that might help alleviate some of the concerns of residents going forward if we were to require a certain amount of landscape buffer, not just an opacity issue, but perhaps a certain depth. How far in can we do that? I don't know, legally if we can do that. So I would say the landscape buffer would be something I'd really like to talk about, and whether that's feasible. And then also, I noticed on the plans they had something about a future tram. Whether or not we can set some sort of parameter on, can they run a tram? Can we, if they're going to do that, can we say it's got to be 400, 500 feet in to the zoo? Because I think that's just, we're talking about a residential area.
Yeah.
So
And I'm gonna, before going to you, Sheldon, I'm gonna ask Hank and Amy to respond to those two issues. Allison's suggesting first that we could put something in the ordinance that would effectively mandate appropriate landscaping. Is that something that you would appreciate?
Well, let me see if I understand it. When you're talking about a landscape buffer, are you setting aside a certain portion of the land and saying to the zoo you can't develop on that land?
it would be, yes, basically saying, so, they have, I don't know how many feet, I think it's like 15 feet on the side of the Huntington Road fence that is closest. I think that's the right of way. So could we give them, that, of course, we have done that, give them that area, plus can we require another 10 feet into the zoo as a 25-foot landscape buffer? That's what the Toledo Zoo has. They have a 25-foot landscape buffer between the residential area and actually the zoo proper.
Okay, let me see if I understand that. So you're talking from the street in about 25 feet?
Well, from the street, yes, including our right-of-way, and then in another 10 feet.
And Allison, I'm assuming you're suggesting that if there are going to be changes from what is there now,
Right.
we would be saying, if you want to make changes, you have to have that buffer.
Right.
As opposed to putting in a buffer right
For the
now.
whole thing, right.
Based on things as they are.
No, right.
Okay, just to make sure I understand. Again, now that the issue has been clarified, I don't know that we could go ahead and approve that, but tonight, of course, because
Right.
that would require a conversation no matter what with the zoo. But any thought or reaction to Allison's suggestion?
Well-
If there are going to be future changes, we should have at least a 25-foot landscape buffer.
Well, it's really only 10 feet, right?
Right.
Sure, but I would hope that they would, like, I'm thinking as far as the planting is concerned, 10 feet may not be enough for them to create something that would be, we wouldn't see what's going on. You know what I'm saying? It's gotta be dense enough so that, I don't know how many plants you can put in a 10-foot area, or trees or shrubs, so.
So again, I'm really sorry, probably should have had this conversation
Sure.
before. But
Right.
in that 10-foot area, you're not saying, don't develop here, you're saying plant here.
Yes.
I think just for clarification, we do have an 80% opacity requirement.
Yep, for fences.
So for fences and that, so I mean, if they were putting up another exhibit or something like that, in areas that haven't already been developed, and they were to fence it in some respect, that would already happen. So I'm
I
not
think-
sure that,
My concern would be whether or not it would be considered a taking of their property, basically saying to them, this is your property, but we're, as a municipality, telling you you can't develop it. Now, I don't know where that goes too far and is reasonable or where it's unreasonable, so that would be something that would have to go to the city attorney.
Okay, and regarding the issue of trams, I assume, Allison, that what you would be looking for is just to make sure along Huntington that there's an ordinance saying thou shall not have any trams running
Yes.
around Huntington.
Absolutely, yes.
Any comment on that, guys?
the zoo understands that the tram was not included in the last iteration of plans that came before us. The other thing is too, is that should they decide to construct a tram or a tramway or use that for that, that would be a change of use in that particular area and would require planning commission approval, and they understand that. That if they have to come back, that if there was any tram proposed, that they were gonna do anything, that it would have to come back.
Okay. Look, I think what Allison, you're saying is, we might as well make it explicit that thou shalt have no trams. That that, in fact, is the judgment of the commission.
Which
Yes.
is what I'm reading
Yeah.
here as.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Sheldon, any general comments?
My question was, you brought up the issue of the difference between the ordinance as reviewed by us and the ordinance that ended up in front of the city commission or some version of that. I'm just curious what those, I don't need word for word, but I need to know, because it suggests that we were not fully informed at the time we made the decision. And I doubt that was the case, but I would like to know what you think was in there that.
Well, what, just so folks are clear, and Amy, hopefully you can refresh my recollection. We were reading, I think because one of the members of the community was reading from an ordinance, something that upon further investigation made Amy, me, and Hank realize that, oops, that was not the one that was passed. And there were significant changes in what Amy did, and I wish I had brought the documents with me tonight, is she gave me the ordinance from which we were reading and the ordinance that was ultimately promulgated. And I can't...
Andy, if I may?
Yep.
There was a point, and I was going to mention this, where I was reading for a copy of the ordinance and suggesting it was missing some things that we were discussing in the room.
Yep.
And Amy rightly corrected me that I had a prior version than the final version that we agreed on.
Mm-hmm.
And that it did contain statements about welfare,
Exactly.
which would include the safety, prosperity, happiness of the
Right.
of the Huntington Woods residents. So that was my mistake. It wasn't a mistake the commission made in what they approved.
Okay. So it wasn't what we approved, what we were...
I was reading from the wrong thing.
Okay, so,
After
and
we
then that was
approved
one of the,
something.
and speaking just very personally, when I thought that there was not an inclusion of health, safety, and welfare, whatever that language was in the ordinance, I said, that's gotta be revisited, let's get this on the agenda. And then if you look at what's before us right now, that language, is in there.
Yes, yeah, Amy corrected me on that. That was, I think I brought in the confusion on that one. I apologize.
So, but there's no harm to be revisiting things. I mean, this is an important ordinance, and we're anxious to hear people's views from the community. Anyone else have any comments?
Yeah, just comment and question. I read through this and, I don't know that it needs any revision in my eyes, other than potentially updating landscaping standards. I think it's gonna be very difficult to define though, because if there's a X amount of feet in theory it's great, but what if they do all low bushes? So I think it has to come back to opacity at some degree. So
Could you just clarify what that is? I'm ignorant about that.
Opacity?
Yes, what does that mean?
It's the amount that you can see through it.
right.
So it's something that's opaque,
Okay.
you can't see through.
Is that
There's-
measurable?
It's like the difference
Right, how do you
between a
measure
pair of
that?
tights or leggings and a pair of pantyhose.
It's much more measurable in a built structure than it is in a natural structure, but
Yeah.
it's probably a healthy estimation at that point, right, Hank?
Pretty,
So,
yeah.
I guess the question I have, Amy and Hank, is, and I might be the only one in the room that doesn't fully understand this, but the zoo, to my understanding, owns up to the fence, right? And we have an easement to the fence.
We have a right of way.
Okay, so where does that right of way end? At the fence?
The property line for the zoo does not run parallel to Huntington Road.
Okay.
So we had a map a long time ago that showed
Yeah.
exactly where it is.
So
So it varies.
I guess
about
what I'm
that.
trying to understand is, City of Huntington Woods has this ordinance. Is the zoo accepting this because they're trying to be a nice neighbor, or is this a legally binding document? Meaning, if they breach this, do we have any legal recourse?
Yes, absolutely.
How? If that's not our property, if we're dictating is this just an agreement that they signed off on? I'm trying to understand.
It's just like residential, you know, if you
Exactly.
built your house too close to the lot line.
But that's not Huntington Woods property. How do we have
It is
jurisdiction?
Huntington, it is Huntington Woods
It's-
property, they happen
yeah.
to own it.
They're within the
Incorporated
The
in the
city of
city?
Detroit
Okay,
owns
so
it.
the whole zoo is
80%
considered.
of the zoo
Okay.
is.
Some of it is Royal Oak.
Okay, that's what I was.
Roughly
I didn't-
from the, halfway through the amphibian exhibit forward is
Okay.
Huntington Woods.
Okay.
Anything else?
No, that's it.
Anything else?
Yeah,
Sorry,
I'm gonna-
Jill?
So I just, I had actually a question for you, Allison, when you're talking about this landscaping buffer and extending the buffer and defining that buffer
Yes.
as, my question is, in the exhibits that have come forth to us, the exhibit doesn't normally start, 5 feet, 10 feet from the fence necessarily. There is space between there, that they are putting trees, and they're doing the higher trees, the mid-level shrubs, the ground cover to get that opacity. So is this potential landscape buffer already built in and you just want to make sure that it is properly landscaped, or do you feel that that buffer doesn't actually even exist?
Question. I mean, I guess I don't really feel that there is. When I drove by the Toledo Zoo, and I guess driving along the residential area, you could not see into the zoo from the road. I mean, a few. So I'm saying that I don't think that there's enough.
So that's not necessarily a distance issue, it's more, as Hank says, an opacity issue, that perhaps you're asking for 100% opacity, which is not necessarily always possible. And as we landscape things, we all know how, things have to grow, things die off, things have to be replaced, and there has to be maintenance of that area. But what I was really trying to understand is, from what I remember of the tiger exhibit plans that we looked at, there is a certain amount of distance that's actually there. They have an access road, and they have landscaping beyond their access road that they are planning to put up, and it probably goes past that 10 feet that you're discussing. And I think that perhaps we just need to do a little bit more definition on what we consider the 80% opacity, maybe, you know what I mean? Does anybody, you understanding what I'm talking about? Maybe we just need to do a better definition of what type of landscape screening there needs to be that.
Maybe it's a better definition of the word screening.
Perhaps a better definition of the word screening, rather than trying to define a distance where, there are existing exhibits that may violate that.
Right. Right.
And as they're defining the best environment for their animals, I'm not so sure we care how, you don't obviously want it right up at the fence, but I don't necessarily know if we're concerned with the distance or just how well that distance is screened. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's, some of the concern would be, if for instance, the access road, the service roads, so anything that we can put in between us and the noise, I mean, anything we can do to add a little bit of extra coverage.
Well, I
would
think
be
that,
helpful.
in my mind, seeing the access, I don't particularly like seeing the access road. I
Right.
look at it and go, oh, look, there's a dirt road. But at the same time, I think that you have to give some chance for the landscaping to grow up, to cover, to, you can't, there's no such thing as instant landscaping, add water, poof, there we have it.
Yep.
So I just would be very careful about trying to push them to say, I want a certain distance, because even though you might get that distance, you still have to make sure that you're defining how you want that distance to be filled, so that we are not viewing the things we don't want to view. That's all. I just
Sure, that's fair.
be careful about distance as opposed to how that distance is used. That's all I'm saying.
Anything else?
No.
Anyone else?
Just as we're talking, and as I had read it earlier, it may just simply be a word change, if at all. So under 510E, where we're talking about storage, service, and maintenance areas, the wording is that they shall be screened, and that would be at the 80% opacity. Under F1, the last sentence, it's landscaping may be required to screen the development
That's a
at the
good catch.
discretion of the city manager.
What line is that in?
That's the last
Hold on.
line
I got
of
it, I got
F1.
it. That's good.
And so that seems to be part of the question we're having is that an option to be
Well, that's
landscaped, or
it's
is
an
that?
ambiguity, so we gotta deal with that.
That was,
What?
One is screened from residential view, the other's at the discretion if it's outside of the 120 feet. So it's
Okay.
presumably not
Sorry about
visible.
that.
past that, okay.
Right.
Okay.
I misunderstood that. Okay, thank you.
I just want to the only thing I struggled with the last approval, I mean, I understand the desire about landscaping, I understand the desire about additional setback, and there's maybe a way to go through that. I was more concerned that we end up with a concrete block wall that we would accept in no way from anywhere else in the city, just long expanse of concrete block wall. And I felt like there was lots of opportunity for them to add features to it, whether they be fake pillars as if it was a fence, or inset with a pattern that, you know, I mean, you look at some of the things that are going on today with construction of bridges and overpasses, things like that, not downtown Detroit, but other cities, right? The concrete has patterns built into it to create interest without, in my opinion, significant cost. And that's why I got really concerned, because unless you have a really cooperative structure with the zoo about maintaining dense landscaping, I'm nervous that you're gonna see through to something we wouldn't accept anywhere else. Anyway.
No, and I guess that is a, point, because both Allison and Aaron, you're raising concerns that we confronted last month with the exhibit, whether it was too monolithic and whether it was visible. So thank you for your suggestions. Anyone else before we open it up to the public? And again, I'm gonna ask that we not applaud and that we keep our time to 2 minutes, so we're respectful of everyone's positions. Anyone else have any comments before we open up the public participation?
I am dovetailing with what Aaron said. I was thinking last time when they were here and we were going over the review, it's too bad that they didn't opt to use some of the original types of building and construction where they had that. They built these exhibits with beautiful bas-relief artwork, built right into the concrete. And that was a very special type of building that was done back at that time, that was brought over from Germany. I thought, isn't it a shame that they don't follow suit with their own style that was started so many years ago, that's historic.
Which buildings represented that?
On
Giraffes.
Okay.
Well, it used to be, but the giraffes, but there's also an area right on Huntington Road, if you look closely, it's, a lot of the paint has come off of it now, but,
The lions,
it's,
back of the lions.
yeah, it's like a bas-relief design. I can't remember if it's Egyptian in format, but
It's the back of the lions.
yeah.
And I guess just before we open it up to public participation, I personally understand exactly what you're saying based on our discussion last month and what we saw. I would feel nervous about purporting not to know how to design something like that, given the fact that they're gonna be animal exhibits. And that would require, I think, at the least, conversations with the zoo as to feasibility and making sure that we can agree on some language that doesn't unnecessarily restrict them in terms of their use of their properties for the animals, but at the same time can predictably and reliably give people relief, particularly if the screening issue isn't fully mitigated.
I agree.
So it's nothing that I don't think we could look at tonight in terms of solving. Okay, anyone else before we open up to public participation? Okay, all those who would like to speak, please identify your name and address. And you have 2 minutes.
I'm Linda Solomon, 8246 Huntington Road. I happen to have a picture, Aaron, of the relief on the, well, I don't want this to go into my 2 minutes, so I have something to say first. And, I think we all agree that Huntington Road is a beautiful street, and we're all on the same team as far as preserving the beauty of Huntington Road and Huntington Woods. And I understand that we have this zoning ordinance that we have to follow, but you guys hold a lot of control over what Huntington Road is going to look like in the future, and this is very important to everyone, not just the people that live on the road, but outsiders that are walking and visitors, and even the zoo has runs, and they say run through scenic Huntington Woods. Well, it's not going to be scenic if it's all brick walls. And without any hesitation, I can say for certain that this is going to affect the public health and welfare of our community. And waking up and coming home every day to enhanced cinder block walls, is not good for anyone's health. And we're already adversely affected by what's going on at the zoo. People bought beautiful, expensive houses, and we didn't expect to live across from the alley of a strip mall. And that's what it's starting to look like, because this is a precedent that you set with the tiger outdoor habitat. There are 3 things that we really would like to see changed in the zoning ordinance. One is the buffer, as Allison's talked about. And, I can see that it's going to take a lot of conversation to get the opacity issue and the depth of the buffer, but I think that's very important. Also, we'd like, and we all agree here, I'm speaking not just for myself, they all have things to say too, but we've talked about this for a long time. We've been coming to meetings for a couple years now.
Just the second thing,
Yes?
and the second thing, sir, so we can.
Okay. The second thing is we do not want trams, trains, any mass transit running along Huntington Road. And the third thing is the zoning ordinance currently allows for tarping within 15 feet of the perimeter fence. And that looks hideous. And that should not be allowed. So I really feel like we're being shortchanged by the zoo. Aaron was talking about how today people are so creative. There's living walls. There's all sorts of things. You made a joke about protecting us with a fence from the tigers. We're not afraid of the tigers. The interior of the tiger exhibit has a moat. They do not have a fence. It's not a fence that is protecting us from the tigers. The fence is protecting the zoo from us seeing anything, and it looks pretty ugly. And then on top of it all, we're paying for it because our taxes are going towards this project.
That's maybe it. Let's see whether or not after people are finished, whether we have more time. Hopefully we will, but I just want to keep it going. Just because I want to maintain the precedent of you're well over.
Okay, well, could you please suspend the rules while I just point out so that you guys know what we're talking about here?
To suspend the rules to do what?
I want to show you at one time, like Martha was saying, the zoo cared about what it looked like on Huntington Road, and I have a picture here of the, what do you call it, the bas relief?
Yeah, it's a,
Yeah, it's very
It's
attractive.
just a slight sculpture that extends out from.
Right, so as old as the zoo is, this has survived. And
Okay.
so there's, I don't know how familiar you guys are because only Aaron lives around the zoo. But I also have pictures of the tarps at the camels, and it's a mess. And the camels are taller than the tarps, and it's in my picture. So this is the whole perimeter. This is earlier in the year, we complained to the city commissioners, and they actually cleaned this up. The zoo cleaned this up within a week. And I want to thank them for speaking up, because they were stockpiling all their building supplies here and using this as a staging area. And I'm not sure if it was Bob or whatever, a group went from the commissioners and talked to the zoo, and they cleaned it all up. But people living here, this is what they were looking at, a bunch of junk. Here, this is across from George Erdstein's house. These are dumpsters turned upside down. This is not acceptable. This is the relief that Martha was talking about. So at one time, you know, and this is not just isolated here, this is in this whole area. These are just, this is what we're concerned about, because we've lost this already, the tiger exhibit, but there are 3 areas of forest that have the potential to have solid brick walls, because we have this precedent. And so this, they actually said is their next project. So this forest, and this is what it looks like, this is gonna come down and eliminate, you know, all the trees, they'll clear cut. He told you 10 to 12 trees, there were over 200, really over 300, but I'm being conservative. Hundreds of trees came down here. This is another forest area. This is, I don't know what their plans are, but this is what we are trying to protect, because otherwise it's gonna be a shopping, the alley of a shopping mall.
Can you, please leave that with the city so we can look at it?
Okay, I want you to really look though at this tarping, because this has been an issue for a long time. When you finally, when we got them to take down the tarp here, it was left in that they could leave this tarp. And there was a man at the last meeting that said he looks out his living room window and it's like a garbage bag blowing in the wind every single day. That's unacceptable. So where is that? Thank you. Yeah, okay,
So the picture's down here.
oh, camels, okay, look at, the camels are over the tarp. Here we are protecting the camels, it's what the zoo tells us, but the camels are looking at us, they're over it. And here, look at it, it's blowing sideways, there's like, you can see right through, it's terrible.
And, yeah, thank you. And Hank, I think that should be available for the commission to look at for future reference. But Linda, your basic point, just to summarize, and I apologize for putting a 2-minute limit because you're clearly speaking for many members of the community. Your basic point is that you've listed 3 things that you're concretely concerned about, specifically concerned about, but you're animated by what you see right now along Huntington, and you think that that suggests that the zoo is not paying enough attention to how it appears to residents in the community. Is that fair?
I think they don't think one iota of residents in Huntington Woods. They do what they want, and we allow it, and it's affecting Huntington Woods. It's going to affect everyone because everyone's going to want lower taxes.
Thank you very much.
Okay, one other thing that I'm just going to pass out. This is a letter that somebody wrote that she's giving to the elected officials, but I thought that you would like to see it.
Is this the letter that was supposed to come my way or not?
You know, there was nothing really that was coming here.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, and we will take a time to read that, obviously.
Thanks.
No, Aaron, I just want to say, I sent you a note, and I did A. Sullivan, and it went to Amy. I forwarded
It was forwarded.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Linda. Next person who wishes to speak?
Andy?
Yep.
I'm gonna run the timer just for information purposes.
Okay. But that was, I agree with Linda's suggestion that she was speaking for the community and she had a lot to present. But now we will enforce the 2 minutes. Anyone else?
Aaron Reddish, 25447 Wareham. I want to reiterate what Linda just said about the 3 points. The green screen, I think, is going to be very important. I want to be very clear that the tram, trolley, train, or whatever needs to be stopped. I want to be proactive in making sure that the zoo doesn't even bring that forward. I know that they've already brought this up in their other plans, and we're concerned about it. And then also the tarps. I do want to make kind of a specific point as we move forward if we're looking at amending the ordinances. And these are 2 specific points. I have it as E2 and E3. E2, which is the minor, that minor changes.
It's F.
I'm sorry, F. Okay. Is it? Well, it doesn't matter. You know, so that the minor changes don't need to go before site plan review. I think the tiger exhibit showed some of the weaknesses there because they were, and Amy, please correct me if I'm wrong, that they were just at that limit of being a minor change to a major change of a building. And I would want you to either eliminate that or please consider revising that down from 700 square feet to something like 200 square feet, which is actually still a major thing. The last point is on point 3. As I read it, it only says that the public health, safety, and welfare of the residents of Huntington Woods should only be considered within the plan review. I think that that should be considered in all of the ordinance.
And that's a very good point. I understand exactly what you're saying.
Okay.
You would basically have that language also
the top.
embodied in number 1.
Right, right, and
And-
maybe boldened.
Yep.
I will say that, I think Linda's is my last point, that it's not just that the zoo does what they want. I think that they do what they need. So if there's ordinances in place, they'll do what they need.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Anyone else?
Good evening, Ray Avedian, 8366 Huntington. I feel like expressing my concern in terms of just establishing what I consider to be a target that we should reach in terms of opacity or screening or whatever you want to call it. At the very minimum, the day that that exhibit opens or when we would practically consider that the exhibit was done, finished in all of its elements, that 80% opacity be met at that point. Not wait for trees to grow. The zoo can put in dense, mature trees. What it costs them is, I don't know, but that opacity target can be met. I would like to see if there's a way of increasing the opacity target to something like 90%. If either of those took place, I think a lot of the concerns that rest with this group would go away. Not all of them, but a lot of them.
Two very concrete suggestions. Thank you. Anyone else?
Hi, Lori Lisi, 8775 Lincoln. I do not live across from the zoo, but I do hear the zoo occasionally, and I think this concerns all Huntington Woods residents. As I had said at a previous meeting, I think the penguinarium shows what the zoo will do if there's not somebody watching over them. And I don't say that it's malicious, but their job is to care about what happens at the zoo. So I think it's this body's job to make sure that the zoo is also thinking about Huntington Woods. I used to drive down Huntington before we moved to this neighborhood. I would make my husband get off the highway at Scotia and drive through to his parents in Royal Oak because I thought it was such a beautiful street, and I hope that it would remain that way. I do think the idea of a buffer and opacity together would be a good way to go. I also think that there should not be a tram on Huntington. I think that sounds like, I think I probably might hear that or the kids screaming. And the last thing I would say is, from talking to the neighbors, it seems like this isn't necessarily a good forum to me for a final determination of what should happen with the ordinance. I don't know if there's some way to have a smaller group that involves people who live across from the zoo where there can be some give and take as opposed to just talking at you and then sitting down. That seems like, to me, that would make people who live across from the zoo feel like more like they're being listened to and they had a chance to have a give and take.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Andy Rimshaw, 8144 Huntington Road. The points have been made. I think that the biggest thing that Raleigh and I, and speaking with all our neighbors, is the commission. It sounds like the commission wants to be involved, is involved, and you guys hold the power to dictate what's going to happen for the city. I'm under the impression you have the best interest of our city because you're residents of the city as yourselves. So I guess I challenge you to step up and really take a look and set the precedents for years to come, because this city is a beautiful city. I love living next to the zoo. I don't dislike living next to the zoo. I live right across. I live right by Jane and Linda, right on that corner. And I love it. I love that corner. And I love the zoo right across the street from me. But if we don't set precedents, it's gonna eat our city away. So with that being said, I hope you guys can take the few extra minutes, take the few extra hours, days, weeks maybe, and set the tone for today, tomorrow, and for the future. So
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Then I will close public participation, and I'm going to itemize for the record, I think the perhaps 7 or 8 concrete suggestions that we received tonight. One is Allison's buffer, which will say also relates to opacity, but not necessarily. There's the concern about trams or trains. There's the concern about tarping. No, those are actually Linda's. Those are the 3 concerns about that Linda made. Then there is a 4th concern that was made by Aaron about the monolithic nature of the exhibits, whether there just be a concrete block wall that we never accept in our houses. Then there is the comment about what does minor modifications mean, and should that be modified so that it applies, if there is going to be that discretion, to smaller exhibits, perhaps 200 square feet. Then there is the drafting concern that was addressed about making sure the public health, safety, and welfare language is incorporated in what we're actually reviewing in site plan in F1. And then there was a suggestion that there would be a timing element to the ordinance, such that whatever percentage, 80 or 90, is expressly incorporated, that be met at the beginning of the opening of a new exhibit. And I believe those are the concrete suggestions that we've heard from the community tonight.
I think one more to
What?
raise the opacity requirement.
Yeah, I kind of put that in there, but if you want to make that another one, fine. But I look at that as the buffer / opacity, but yes, of course, from 80 to 90. And I think personally, this is just me speaking for myself, that those are very concrete, constructive, good faith suggestions. And we certainly owe it to ourselves and to the community to entertain them, to assess their feasibility, to discuss them more in the community with the, with the zoo, because we got to worry about feasibility. And I guess my question is to the panel, do you as a group agree that these issues require further thought? And if the answer to that is yes, then I'm going to ask Amy and Hank what's the best process to go about engaging in that additional analysis and consideration, so that our decision making is fully informed. So, initial question to the panel: do you agree with at least my personal assessment that what we listened to tonight warrants further consideration? They're very specific, and I'm not saying anyone is right or wrong, but they require further consideration. Does anyone disagree with that? No.
No.
Okay. So,
I think you forgot
what's that?
my suggestion.
What was that?
That there be some other forum to include
Well,
residents.
that's going to the next
the
one.
process?
I'm right now I'm establishing that the commission agrees that the suggestions warrant further discussion. And I think there's unanimity that the commission does agree that at least some of these, perhaps all, require further discussion and study. Fair enough, guys? Okay. So Hank and Amy, in light of what you're hearing, and I think there's a consensus, do you have suggestions how to vet these ideas and how to make sure that whatever changes may be made to the ordinance, withstand scrutiny, meaning that it's feasible from the perspective of the zoo, meaning that so that it doesn't unnecessarily restrict what they can do. It's legal, so that we're not, as someone said, expropriating or appropriating land that we would be liable for in terms of restrictions of use, and that it also meets the needs of the community, and that the language, as Ms. Lisi said, is something that doesn't surprise anyone and is acceptable to all stakeholders and all residents. Do you have a suggestion how to do that?
I think that we need to have a phone conference with both the planner, who to give us an idea of what he sees in other communities in terms of, for instance, how soon the opacity requirement needs to be met, and the city attorney as well, to make sure that what we are gonna write into this ordinance is reasonable, and that we're not gonna get a countersuit for being, too restrictive and unreasonable. That there's gotta be a middle ground somewhere in between there. The only thing, and then we could work on language for the black wall, because I think what you're looking for is a 360-degree treatment. But again, that's gonna, obviously we can't tell them to put windows in, right? So
Agree.
it needs to be, maybe put something into the effect of that needs to be taken into consideration, but deal with it on a case-by-case basis, depending on what the exhibit is. And then I would check again with the city attorney in terms of the buffer idea and the tram, and whether or not those uses, the tram use, can be purposefully excluded. And the buffer, and when you talk about the buffer, when you're talking about a development going in, you're talking about requiring them to plant 10 feet from the fence line and the 15 feet outside of the fence line?
I don't know what that would look like. I guess I'm just trying to figure out how much can we put in between the residents and the zoo to give them the noise buffer, to give them the site buffer, that kind of thing.
How about this as a suggestion? Okay, we've really specifically identified what the issues are of concern to the community. How about we do it in 3 stages? Stage number 1 is the city staff will assess the recommendations, will engage in conversation with the zoo to come up with, in light of what we've heard, proposed revisions to the ordinance that would address appropriately, even if that doesn't necessarily include making a change, just so we have a reason for not making a change if that's the result, the concerns addressed. Those changes would be presented to the city, the planning commission. We would look at them, because we have to do this as part of an open meeting act compliance meeting, right? We couldn't do this ad hoc, right? Is that correct? We couldn't do this in groups or anything like that, is that correct? We have to have it all together.
To make a decision, you do, yes.
Yes.
What about for a consultation? Let's keep it simple. You guys talk to the zoo, you've heard, make the changes that you think are appropriate. You present those to us at the next at another planning commission meeting. You explain why certain things have been done or not been done, or why certain things have to be done a different way than maybe what was contemplated, or why we can't. And then we will have another, and there's no voting at that point, at that meeting, but we had a planning commission meeting. And then we'd have another meeting where it would be presented to the community with the expectation that if all things go well at that meeting, there would be a vote to revise. And we'll see how that meeting goes. If the meeting doesn't go well, the vote will go one way. If the meeting goes well, it'll go another way. Now, regarding your point, my concern is the Open Meetings Act. And I guess it would be good to be able to do this informally, so there can be organic conversation.
Right.
The question is, can you do it to us, or would your communications have to be with the city? Because I don't think, and maybe Bob knows, is a way for there to be anything informal so there can be dialogue without violating the Open Meetings Act?
Conversation could certainly go through the city manager with ideas and thoughts without any issues.
So like, for instance,
Maybe one member of the planning commission, that's gonna be okay. What you have to make sure you're not doing is making decisions or having discussions amongst members of the.
so if
planning
one or
commission.
two members of the planning commission were to participate in that process with Amy and Hank, so that we could hear, but not make any decisions, but have it, give you guys an audience, so there's something informal, but still fluid and real, that would not violate the Open Meetings Act? Well, I think that's the way to do it.
Andy, I'm confused by the Open Meetings Act. I thought as long as it's announced and open to the public, we can talk in any manner we see fit.
Okay, I'd like to know that, because
Am
my
I
understanding, what's your understanding? Because my understanding is that, what, for instance, when you sent me an email today that we have to be careful not to violate the Open Meetings Act, what exactly did you mean by that?
It means not having discussions, not in a public forum, so that residents can see the debate and the discussion and what went into it and how you came to your decision, not doing it behind closed doors, if you said, if you will, and come to the meeting. Now, Aaron, I think what he's talking about is meeting as a group, listening to residents, but having it be a more informal process. There's no reason why you can't do this. It's not that it's illegal, it's just that these meetings are set up to be a formal process. And so it's difficult to make them informal when they're supposed to be structured.
Okay, and I agree that structure is very important, but at the same time, what I would suggest is that there'll be two members of the community who interface with you guys, and then there will be two members of the commission who likewise interface with either you guys and or the community, so that there is that exchange of ideas, even though it's not going to be with everyone. So that at least provides some structure. So there's an idea give and take, and the insurance policy would be, there's going to be that meeting where we're going to have presumably a revised ordinance presented, where there can again be kick the tires, objections, concerns, or validation. Does that sound like a process that will work as we engage in this?
So the idea would be to put together recommendations or modifications to the ordinance and kind of bounce it off a test group of residents and get their feedback.
Yeah, my suggestion is, the residents can feel free to, any resident can feel free to contact you. And that you're gonna use that feedback as a basis for making revisions or proposals. That will also include consultation with the zoo. You will involve at least two members of this commission to make sure that we're in the loop as these conversations are going on. That process is going to result in your proposing something to us as in the form of a revised ordinance that will come to us at a meeting. We'll discuss it. We'll make a decision at that meeting whether we think there should be further revisions, or in turn whether we should, alternatively, whether we should present it to the public at a subsequent meeting at which we would vote, presumably. Does that sound like a workable plan, everyone? Okay, so I don't think we need to vote on any of this, do we, at this point?
No,
Hank?
you just give us direction.
Is that concrete enough?
Yep.
We've got that.
Okay, so I think that's where we are, and I hope that's clear enough. And so I think we can move on to the next item on the agenda. Everyone cool with that? Okay, so we're gonna do that. We're gonna move on. Thank you, everyone, by the way, for your very constructive comments. They were valuable and clear. Next.
Andy, might I ask, in terms of appointing those two people that I'm not necessarily volunteering for, but essentially you're asking for that to form like a sub-study group.
Yeah.
To come back to us in a public forum and identify the issues and the possible solutions that have been presented.
I'm asking basically to work with Hank and Amy so that we're involved in this process, so no one's surprised.
But they report back to us.
Oh, yeah, as a committee, sure.
It's like an advisory.
Yeah, I'd say an advisory group.
Yeah, I'm sensitive to the
Yeah.
open meetings.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, everyone, for their suggestions. The next item on the agenda is the matter of public hearing, home occupations, section of the zoning ordinance.
So when the zoning ordinance was adopted, the, 2 additional businesses were added to, prohibited uses. And a resident brought it to my attention. We brought it back to the planning commission to see if you wanted to, include those 2 new uses. They were law office and real estate office. And from there, the conversation kind of went, well, let's take a look at why are we, prohibiting psychologists, the psychiatrists, et cetera. So we did provide information, recommendations from the city attorney and the public safety director with respect to counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists. But we're still back at the beginning, which is, do you want to add in real estate office and law office? So our recommendation would be just to keep the ordinance the same as it was in the original zoning ordinance. That was working.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it type thing?
Yeah.
Okay. Does anyone have any opinions about, before we open up to public participation, that we would be comfortable with if it ain't broke, don't
Wait a minute,
fix
are we
it?
talking about returning to the definition that was in the previous ordinance?
Yes.
Or if it ain't broke, meaning the current ordinance?
Returning it to before.
Right.
Okay, just one
So
thing.
are we saying that we are going to allow real estate
Yes.
and?
Yeah.
Okay. I
Copy
guess,
of the prior
Well,
one.
by allow, what that means is that they still need to comply with the ordinance.
okay.
But you could be, presumably you could be an attorney within your home and it would be permitted by the home occupation ordinance. Now, if you had an office and you had clerical staff and, lots of clients coming to your house that are causing disruption, then it wouldn't be allowed. So we would just apply provisions of the home occupation ordinance to those 2 types of businesses. We wouldn't prohibit them outright, right off the bat.
I guess I just hesitant to disallow people from running businesses in their home if they are not, like the kind where there's trucks coming and lots of employees that are parking on the street. I've experienced that behind me one year. There was a business with lots of, and when the cops came over and flushed them out, then they just came around the corner and parked in front of my house for a while. The thing here is that I'm not seeing any, I mean, I see the statement that they've had experiences with troublesome patients in some of these therapy practices or psychological practices, but I'm not seeing statistics. And you know what? You can get nasty people in law offices and nasty people in real estate offices too if they're not getting what they want or the price that they want for their home. I mean, I just feel like we're not on real solid ground with being able to allow some things and disallow others, because we don't really have any statistics that prove that one is gonna be safer than another. I mean, it's just by experience here, but has there been any research done, in general with regard to these different kinds of businesses as to, I mean, people can get snarky in stores and, so it kind of troubles me. I know of a lot of people in the area who happen to run, businesses in their home, and see patients and have never had any problems at all. And it's kind of like saying, well, geez, if you're seeking help, that, you might be more trouble than somebody else, and that bothers me, so.
Just to understand your position, you're suggesting that we go back to the way it was before?
The way it was before does prohibit
It's always prohibited.
psychiatrists, psychologists, and counselors.
Okay.
Hank, we don't have a copy of the current ordinance, do we, in this packet, unless I'm missing it?
I think you have basically what we were asked to provide was the comments or whatever we have, advice from the city attorney.
Right.
So why don't we go in a horseshoe fashion as to have concerns, so there's some structure to this. We'll start with Kim.
Yeah, I share some of Martha's concerns, and even reverting back to the prior ordinance versus the change that it allowed or disallowed attorneys and realtors in one section or another. It does feel arbitrary to me, and which occupations we're saying are good enough and which ones are not good enough or safe enough, and feels very elitist, maybe by design, I don't know, but it doesn't make, I feel uncomfortable with making those choices between why an attorney can practice and why a psychiatrist cannot practice, among other things. I mean, that's not the only one, but I think those are the ones that seem to be the closest in terms of professional training level, types of traffic, all of those, but we're saying one is okay and one is not. Without seeing any other, I see opinion, but I don't see, as Martha has said, fact. It may be there. If you could show it to me, I might feel more comfortable with that. Also hearing from the attorney that many cities don't go into this detail of which occupations are allowed and disallowed, just I think, to me, it's more important to know that there's not any dangers to neighbors. The sound, smells, traffic are the things that are enforceable, and we can use those to, I guess, police it, as it were. So that's where I stand.
Aaron?
I guess I would echo Kim's comments. I think she summed it up well. I think the first time it came in, I just kind of, if it's not broke, don't, if it's.
Don't fix it.
Thank you. For some reason that sounds wrong in my head, yeah. And didn't really put a lot of thought. Now we've kind of opened up Pandora's box here, and I don't know how to make this decision right now between the different professions. I'm not sure I really understand Amy's point about when you're allowed to practice law, but if you're not seeing clients, it's okay, but when you start seeing clients, that's when you run into trouble?
No, I'm sorry. What I meant was, if you are running a business out of your home and nobody knows about it, then that's perfectly legal, right? So if you are, an attorney.
Unless it's illegal.
Right, unless it's not allowed.
Well,
We'll get to that in a couple
so
bullet
you can
points.
take that attorney, go either way, right? If you have an attorney who's just reading contracts all day and is not seeing any clients and doesn't have any employees, and the next door neighbors don't even know that he's practicing attorney in that home. But if it's an attorney that establishes an office and has clients come and has a staff, and so now there's employees parking on the street, well, it's still an attorney, but now it's a violation of the home occupation ordinance because it's a nuisance to the neighborhood.
It's a violation because somebody complains, or it's a violation inherent in something they're doing?
It's not inherent to what they're doing, it's whether or not it's a nuisance to the neighborhood.
So how come we don't just establish what's a nuisance to the neighborhood?
That
We
is in
did.
here, that's in
That's
here.
there as well.
Right, so why don't we just enforce what's a nuisance to the neighborhood instead of calling out specific professions?
That's the way your ordinance has always been written.
No, I guess that was kind of a rhetorical question.
Hank?
Sorry.
Yeah, I guess
That
a
was
little
mine.
bit more of the history of this. When you take a look at it, it says auto repair, minor or major, noise, smells, toxins, oil changes, all that stuff. That's why that was in there, for auto repair, minor or major. Barber shops, people coming and going all the time. Same with the beauty parlor, people coming and going all the time, so there was traffic issues with those two. That's why those two are in there. Carpentry work, by virtue of the fact that somebody doing it as a trade can have saws running nonstop from 8 o'clock in the morning until 9 o'clock at night,
Sure.
and create a noise ordinance violation, and also a nuisance for the neighbors next to them if they don't happen to be fans of carpentry. Dental or medical office, those types of professions in a home setting just aren't conducive. You can't possibly use medical gases, those type of things in a residential setting, so that's why those were not in there. Also, typically, those types of professions, along with psychiatrists, psychologists, and attorneys, typically would find themselves in an office setting as to be more professional than a home setting, and that's why those two were in there. The dealers of firearms were done specifically because we had residents' complaints. and people were concerned, this was years ago, over their neighborhood constant coming and going for guns and that type of thing being dealt out of a house, and it was decided that was a use that was better delegated to the business districts and that type of thing, and that's why those were in there. Food processing became a big issue back when Gale's Chocolates was in Huntington Woods, and there was deliveries at all times of day, smells, that type of thing, and as a result, food processing and preparation were there. Massage therapy became an issue at the point because visiting in houses for massage therapy was very difficult to regulate, and the concern was that in other communities there's been experience with illicit activity, and as a result there was no way that they wanted that in the neighborhood when they could have it in a professional setting where it could be regulated, and there was a professional office setting. So these type of things were all considered. The law office and real estate office similarly, because law offices and real estate offices are again professionals, and those were types of offices that were best suited in a professional setting. Real estate offices, people constantly are visiting in and out, and traffic in the neighborhoods. And traffic in the neighborhoods was a big thing when these were considered, all of these, because people coming and going, and as we get into the social worker, counselor, psychologist, psychiatrist, that type of thing, all have people visiting. We've had several complaints over the years, including complaints where there's been public safety runs, as to where there's been people sitting out in front of people's houses, and people became very unnerved about that because they were waiting to be seen across the street or next door for whatever reason, and now all of a sudden you've got cars stacking up in the street waiting to be seen by a psychiatrist, psychologist, social worker. There's no way of verifying what these people are there for. In a professional setting, it's much easier to control, and the fear was there, and again, this goes back years and years and years ago, because that was in the previous ordinance as well as this ordinance, that you didn't know what people were being treated for and why they were being brought into the neighborhoods, and that's not my words, those are the words that complaints were voiced to us for that. So that's where they go with that. Painting of vehicles, trailers or boats, smells, vehicles.
Hank, what were the two ones that were new?
The two ones that were new were
Law
real
office and
estate,
real estate.
yeah, real estate and law office.
Okay, and, okay, I just wanna make sure we're clear. Thank you for that, you know, obviously litany of reasons. Anything else, Aaron?
You know, I can think of, I'm sorry. I was just listening to the list and thinking, on my little street on Elgin, in my life, there was a gal down the street that had a business in her basement, and next to Sandy Schumach's house, and she used to cut my hair. She had a little couple of chairs down there and did a nice booming business, and everybody really enjoyed being able to go there in the neighborhood. Across the street, the Colliers had a race car in their garage, and they had people coming and going all times of the day and night, working on that car, and he did the race circuit all over, and it was just part of the neighborhood. My next door neighbor turns wood, and he does glass blowing, so we got lots of fumes, and she's got a kiln going all the time. And you know, and these are all things that they just happen, and I'd hate to tell you how many times I can't even get down my street because of hockey parties on my street, and these are not businesses, they're just people living. So we deal with these kinds of things all the time, but to tell somebody they can't work out of their house because that's the only way they can do it, they can't afford rent for, to get an office building and then work within that confines, I'm kind of uncomfortable with it, so.
Thank you. Any comments?
Yeah, is there a definition of when working from home becomes a home occupation?
Yeah, you can't occupy over 25% of your residence with that occupation.
No, but as far as.
No outside storage, that type of thing. It's not like there's a threshold where it's like if you see 2 clients a day, there's no threshold for that, and we couldn't regulate that. So if that's, and I'm not sure where you were going with that, but if that's where you were going with that, it goes, part of it goes to the fact that there's no way we could regulate that.
Anything else?
Well, I guess my only comment would be that, you know, law offices and real estate office, I could see not having the foot traffic. And if that becomes the issue, the solution really be permitting professionals, but putting the limitation that they cannot see clients? Because someone else had raised online therapy at our last meeting as whether that would be permitted or not. And to Amy's point, the reality is we would never know if someone was doing online therapy, but it seems that the issue is the foot traffic and permitting professionals to work if they're not gonna be seeing clients makes sense compared to the list of other things that have an effect outside of the home.
Anything else?
Nope.
Jill?
I have no comments.
I don't know that I'm uncomfortable defining all these, I just think we're getting ourselves into a never-ending.
Cycle.
You can't do a yoga studio in your garage because that's gonna create traffic, you know, it's almost like the zoo to me. It feels like we need to build the ordinance that we can police it. You know, that was a question, you know, all those examples that Linda brought, are those violations that we just don't have the capacity or ability to enforce, or are they actually things we need to put in place? It feels like we have things in place that if we wanted to go after A, B, and C that she showed, we probably could. And I wonder about the same thing with this. Do we have the ability to police this? I mean, we have landscapers all over Huntington Woods running out of their house. It's insane. That's not something that, I don't know if it's technically allowed or not, but whether it is or isn't, it's not policed right now. So, and I don't know if that's as a city, do we have the ability to control that? I don't know.
Well, just to give you a little bit of background on that, landscapers can qualify as a special use. Whether all of them have special uses or not, that I can't answer. But I can tell you that, like, as far as some of the things that you bring up with the others, we have policed them, and we have closed down offices of psychiatrists, psychologists, and counselors. Sometimes we get information based on public safety issues. Sometimes we get neighbor complaints, which we've had. Sometimes these are in areas of the city that you wouldn't expect them to be in. And we do get calls on this. This is not something that happened once and we wrote an ordinance for it. This ordinance well predates this zoning ordinance. It goes way back, back when Bonnie was here many years ago and wrote the original ordinance for that. So it's been past experience. And then if you take a look at the recommendation from Johnson Rosati, which is our city attorney, and the city planning consultant in that memo also concurs with it, is that it's a policy decision as to whether or not the city wants to allow it. From a public safety perspective, they believe that there should be no home occupations, that occupation should be done in a business setting. So there's your schools of thought for that.
Yeah, I get it. It seems to me that would, whoops, make, stop. It would make, yeah, seriously.
I moved and the noise went off. I was wondering if my chair was booby trapped.
It seems to me it would make more sense to build an ordinance that allows us to control these rather than trying to list the millions of occupations that are allowed and are not allowed, I guess.
Anything else?
No, thanks.
Sheldon?
Okay, I have no problem with things like bump shops and drive-through restaurants in residential areas being specifically barred. I do suggest that the city attorney's letter, in part says communities try to regulate home occupations by mitigating negative impacts upon adjacent properties in the neighborhood as a whole, ensure that home occupation maintains a residential character. This is typically done by setting limitations on the number of customers, number of employees, and so on. I would like to see a sample of that kind of an ordinance to see if it's workable in this city. And we don't have to take an all one way or the other approach. We can say you can't have a bump shop. I don't hear any objections to barring that. And maybe have a specific list and then set these other criteria based upon these other examples. We can consider that as a foundation for determining that there's a intrusive or offensive home occupation. But I'm concerned that we have measurable standards that are easy for the citizens and for the enforcement people to interpret. Okay, that's always my concern, is that there be clarity and due notice.
Okay. Allison?
I shared his thoughts as well. I think that in the digital age that we're in, we have a lot of people doing business out of their home, and they wouldn't be seeing necessarily people. But I would have a concern with psychiatrists, thinking of children running through the neighborhood, and if there's someone who's coming in for some sort of mental health issue that could be dangerous to a child who's riding their bike by. I mean, you could go on and imagine all the things that they could be there for. That would be the only thing that gives me pause as far as seeing clients in that capacity.
Thank you. Is that it? My reaction to this is a can of worms, and do we really want to deal with it? And if we do want to deal with it, we obviously can't do it in an ad hoc way right now. I also understand the issues, and obviously the kind of prejudice, that some people might bring to this when dealing with psychiatric or psychological patients or clients. But I'm just worried about, going down a real bad rocky road where we'd have to engage in some real legislative decision making that I don't know that we're equipped. And more importantly, there isn't a problem. No one's talked about there being a problem with the legislation, and to start re-engineering it strikes me as possibly wasted energy. And I know that real estate and attorneys were recently added. Those are the two that were added, right, guys?
That's correct.
So that we don't start shoveling a lot of bad stuff in a very, very big pile, or from a very big pile. I'm thinking that the way to do it for now is to revert back to what there was for years and years and years and years without problems. Strike the real estate and attorney reference, and then if this commission desires, take a long look at things, but I don't know how productive that's going to be.
Can I add something? We have a very robust home occupation ordinance already on the books that already specifies exactly what qualifies as a home occupation, that lists things that are prohibited. You can't have a business that has, generates excessive pedestrian or vehicle use, noise, odor, smoke, dust. So those standards have already been met and are incorporated into our ordinance. The ordinance went a step further and said, instead of the city having to decide whether or not a business violated one of these, let's say the noise portion of the home occupation, if there was an auto repair, the assumption was made.
Right, certain things are prima facie violative, so we don't want to have to deal with it. So I guess my question is, so we don't get into a morass, is there a consensus or not that the best thing to do right now is go back to where we were before, because there didn't seem to be problems with what there was before.
Is that what this is?
Yeah.
Is this before?
This is what's,
no.
this
No,
is
it's
now.
current.
This is
And the new stuff is
Law office and real estate.
law office and real estate.
But that is an exclusive list.
What?
That is an exclusive list. If you're not on that list,
Then you're going to be governed by the overarching ordinances and
Which is
standards.
Those are
above it,
prohibited.
right?
Well, there's
Well, that's
also
not what that
another
says.
thing, there's also another thing too, it says, below it, you have uses that can qualify with a special use. And, it lists some of the things that may be qualified with a special use permit. So that's things that would have to come before the planning commission for special use. So those are things like bakers, confectionery, dance instruction, somebody mentioned yoga.
We had the home care one time.
Yeah, at that point in time, offices of landscaper, photo studio, food preparation, locksmith, or other tradespeople. Those are the types of things that could be allowed, but they require a special use.
So, look, we could go down a long, long, winding road on this one. Is there a consensus or is there not a consensus that this is not something that we need to touch, other than perhaps allowing it to return to the form it was in before the change was made? So we would strike real estate and attorney from the list.
Would we put them into the special use category, or would we just strike them,
I
period?
think just strike them. I mean, just so, my feeling is if it ain't broke, let's not try and fix it. We know it wasn't broke before, because things were fine, people weren't complaining. I don't remember anyone saying that this was a result of, these changes were a result of things that people were complaining about. And, you know, I just think this is going down a deep hole. So I would propose, and I don't know if anyone agrees with this, just to revert back to the way it was before when there wasn't a problem.
Yeah, I think to Amy's point, as soon as the law office had staff, it wouldn't be allowed anyway. As soon as the real estate office had staff, it wouldn't be allowed anyway.
Right.
So I'm with Andy on this.
I agree.
The more I read, the more I think we're opening a can of worms.
Although I am chuckling of photo developing. Who does that anymore?
Well, you know, we're amending
And
the
if
ordinance.
they're worried about noise,
Strike
why don't
that.
they have a piano teacher on there, because in
At
the
the
summertime
time,
with the windows
too,
open, they
I-
can be
I-
pretty annoying.
That's
they do.
explicitly allowed though.
Only
They
if
do
they're good.
professional photographers, and the other thing is too, is that within
Very
the last
people
couple of years, we have shut down an auto repair for business in the city of Huntington Woods.
So does anyone wanna make a motion to go back to the way it was before in the good old days?
So moved.
Can I say it that way?
Yeah,
I'd like to go back to the good old days.
yeah. But the motion would be just amend it such that it was consistent with what we had before.
Right, so we will go back, have Carol draft up the proposed language amendment, and then it comes back here. You want to set the public hearing for?
Do we need a
the
public
next
hearing for
meeting?
this?
Yes,
Okay, so we have to vote to have a public hearing then right
that
now?
is correct.
Isn't this a public hearing?
No.
No, this is
This
just
is a
discussion.
discussion.
So the motion would be to have a public hearing after Carol makes the revision consistent with what we've been talking about tonight?
Now
Just
you're
go back
just
to the old
opening
days?
the worms.
Okay,
We could do that by the March meeting next week, right?
We could do that, certainly. I could
Yeah.
add it on and amend
But
the
but now
agenda.
we might as well, if there's anything in here we're not comfortable with, we might as well change it if we have to approve it. Do that.
that's the
Do it.
can of worms.
Do it.
We can justify it just by it staying what it was.
Yes,
Yes.
that's my point.
Right.
Yeah.
Publish it, but to
So that solves our problem.
Yeah.
So does anyone wanna make a motion,
for final adoption.
please?
I thought Jill did. Oh,
Jill, did you make a motion?
No, you did. You said so.
I want to make
moved,
a
but yeah.
motion to have a public hearing to take us back to the good old days.
Okay, and the
Oh.
good old,
That's what I said.
I want to make a motion to have a public hearing to remove the additions that were made for law offices and real estate offices to the prohibited home occupations.
is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? Up one, so it's, two, who's the second?
Kim.
Okay, Kim, so 7-2. Motion's passed. Okay, next item on the agenda is the zoning ordinance to clarify process for special land use approvals and site plan reviews in the proposed historic districts. I understand that this is ministerial, but would you explain this one?
Sure, there was, it was brought to my attention by a resident who went through the zoning ordinance rewrite that, with regards to special land use and site plan use, there was a reference to a proposed historic district, and he was very concerned about exactly what that meant, and when does an historic district become proposed, et cetera, so. It is regulated by state law. If a community is considering a historic district, and we are not, but if a community is considering it, there's a certain steps that a community has to go through that process. And once certain criteria are met, then the city commission can decide that any new development within that historic district that's being considered, instead of falling under the purview of the planning commission for site plan review, would go under the purview of the historic district, while that area is still under consideration for whether or not it should be a historic district. So what we are recommending is that the language of the zoning ordinance be tied to the existing ordinance that regulates historic districts, so that anybody who wants to know how this process
I mean,
plays
statute,
out
the statute, the state statute.
can refer back to that
Right.
statute.
Public Act 169.
And this is a public hearing.
So this is a public hearing for this?
This is public.
So the motion would be simply to adopt the language as presented on the red line.
Well, recommend to the city commission that they adopt it.
Okay. Any discussion?
Yeah, I think you have to, well, there's nobody here, but I think you have to ask for public comment.
Oh, public comment, Bob?
No thanks.
Okay, public participation closed. Any discussion?
Yeah. My concern here, and it's a continuing concern I've had with the historic district, is that there doesn't seem to be any kind of a time limit as to the consideration of whether or not something is subject to a historic district or a planned historic district. And so if somebody submits a plan and says, I want to do X, Y, Z, the process, and I'm not suggesting that the city has languished in that in prior. They've been very diligent about determining what was in a historic district and what wasn't in a historic district. But the language about in an area that's being contemplated as a possible historic district concerns me in that it basically not chills, it kills any proposed development or improvement to anybody who wants to do that in that particular area if it's being contemplated for a historic district. And there doesn't seem to be a time limit on it, at least not here that I see. Maybe there's one in the statute. And my concern is that somebody might be, who wants to do something with their house, just can't do, even whether it's necessary or not necessary, to their house. And it's not like it's automatically disapproved if it hasn't been approved in a certain amount of time, or it's automatically approved if it hasn't been disapproved.
Hank?
Because that would trigger remedies as far as the resident is concerned, in terms of being able to continue
Yeah.
with their,
To clarify, just for the edification, Public Act 169 of 1970 is the Local Historic Districts Act. That act was put in place, and it is a blueprint for exactly how you would create a historic district, or how you would create your historic district commission, and also how you would create your historic district study committee. In that blueprint, it specifically states what has to happen, when it has to happen, and the timeframes. The timeframes are governed by the Public Act, so in order to establish a successful historic district and to be recognized by the state, you have to comply with that. You have to create a preliminary report, and then you have to create a final report. During those times, there's timeframes that have to be met, and when the city commission, typically like with the last round of historic districts that we had, and the last one that we had was a Rackham Golf Course, which adds another layer of security for our residents that won't be redeveloped. You have a time frame that you have to act in. So there has to be something given by the city commission. They have to appoint a study committee. During that point in time, they say that anything that would have to go before a planning commission would go before the historic district commission. So at that point in time, it would be no different than coming before the planning commission for an addition or something of that nature. It would be going in front of the historic district commission instead of the planning commission.
but the historic district
So-
has different standards about what they will permit or not permit.
Not necessarily. They have standards that apply for materials and types of things, which now basically with the character reviews are much more similar to what the planning commission looks at. So it doesn't mean that you can't add on in a historic district. It doesn't mean that you can't add on in a historic district right now, because we do have projects going right now in the historic district. What it does mean is that it goes to a different body for consideration as far as that. And what it does is, the language for Public Act 169 that's been proposed as far as clarification for you is it tells you where to reference what happens and when it
Is this a
happens.
fair characterization of this revision, that all it does effectively is incorporate by reference as required by law,
Absolutely.
public state law, so that there's no ambiguity as to the standards? It's
Absolutely.
state, isn't it?
It's simply a clarification.
Okay.
Could you tell me what the time is that the city has to do its study and make the report for a,
You know, why don't we give you that public app?
I'm happy to give it to
Yeah.
you, but it's, I believe off the top
I
of
can
my
look
head,
it up,
it's
that's
6
okay.
months.
It's right there. It's MCL 399.4143.
yeah, I got a copy of that
And when we
available.
went
You
through
can get it on the
and
computer.
studied what is the first historic district, the Hill Historic District, we did have some cases where people needed to do something right away, and the study committee convened, and, you know, we were able to help those people.
Nobody wasn't heard.
Yeah, nobody was hurt by it, but it, you know, it,
Okay.
Any other discussion? Anyone want to make a motion? And the motion would be to recommend it to the commission as presented to us.
I move to recommend, this to the commission as presented to us.
Second?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? One. Anyone else other than Sheldon? 8-1. Okay, thank you, Sheldon. Next item up is the matter of public hearing for amendments to the zoning ordinance regarding medical marijuana. Can you guys give us some background on that?
Yeah, basically, the legislation, that's come out with regards to medical marijuana, has been changing and evolving. As a result, we constantly have to kind of keep up with what's going on with that. The language that's here is recommended to us by our city attorney, simply to be consistent with the state law as it evolves with medical marijuana. It's probably not the last amendment you'll see with this, but it is one that we do need to establish to bring us current. This is a matter of housekeeping. We simply have to adopt the change in order to be consistent with the state law.
Thank you. Any comment on this? We have a letter from the law firm saying, do it this way, based on its study of this one statute, this one case.
Yeah, and you will have to, the motion would be to recommend it to the city
Right.
commission.
Any discussion? Anyone want to make a motion? Oh, public participation? Bob? Speak now or you never get your chance. No, public participation is closed. Anyone want to make a motion?
Move to adopt the suggested changes as presented to us.
Second?
Second.
All those in favor, say aye. That one was unanimous. The last one for the evening is matter of public hearing for the deletion of the definition of the term substantial improvement from the definition section of the zoning ordinance. Hank, you wanna do that one? Oh, sorry.
I got into a somewhat in-depth conversation with the resident who brought some of these other issues to my attention about exactly what substantial improvement meant, and we were really going down a rabbit hole. When I went back and I did a scan of the zoning ordinance, and this definition is not used in the zoning ordinance anywhere, except in the definitions. So in order to take care of that discussion, I said, we'll just eliminate it.
Fair enough.
We don't need to define it any further. So that was.
So definition of something that doesn't need to be defined, so there's no more definition.
If you don't use it, there's no
Yeah.
reason for it.
Right, or argue about what it means.
Well, I
Good
think
for
that's
you.
a nice tidy cleanup. How did it get in there?
Just a kind of boilerplate language from the
Okay.
planner.
Okay. Any discussion on this one?
Public hearing.
Public hearing? Bob? What, did we cat out your tongue tonight?
It's nice to be the only person here.
Okay, public participation is closed.
Public.
Any discussion, and I guess the motion to be discussed would be to adopt the recommendation to delete the definition.
I move to adopt the deletion of the recommendation, or the deletion of the. I don't know what I'm saying, I'm tired. I move to remove the definition for substantial improvement.
Okay,
And recommend that to the city
I
commission.
recommend it
for
to the
adoption.
city commission.
yeah, any seconds for that very
second it.
wonderful
Oh.
motion? Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay, see you next week, right? Oh, any motion for, do we have public?
Move to adjourn.
No, we have public participation. Bob?
Bob?
Okay, that public petition is closed. Moves to adjourn. All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, see you next week.
Thank you.
How many do we have on the agenda for next week?